Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, the Byline Times podcast. This time, stop and search. When is it reasonable for the police to stop members of the public and demand to frisk them on pain of being taken down to the station if they refuse? Home Secretary Priti Patel has permanently lifted restrictions on this hugely controversial practice whenever the police think violence may occur. But this follows a recent report by the Independent Office of Police Conduct, which called for action to reverse the disproportionate use of stop and search on people from Black, Asian and other ethnic minority backgrounds. We'll be hearing from Mike Bankole, who researches race, racism and representation at King's College London, also co-hosts the Jam Politics podcast. But we'd also like to hear from you as well. If you're listening live via Twitter Spaces to Byline Radio, there is a little microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you tap that and you want to join in, maybe you've got an experience that you want to share with us. Maybe you can shed some light on the whole question of stop and search, whether you've been working for law enforcement or whether you yourself have been stopped on the street. Maybe you've got a question to ask of Mike as well, but by all means do join in. We're keen to hear as many different voices as we possibly can. And before we get cracking as well, just a reminder that Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast are funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times. If you don't know what that is, well, it's a brilliant monthly newspaper edited by my colleague Hardeep Matharu. Free and fearless, independent journalism that isn't controlled by oligarchs or people who live somewhere else or who have offshore accounts and somehow manage to control big parts of the British media. It is just honest journalism. So if you believe in that and you want to support it, please think about taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. You get details of how you can do that on our equally brilliant news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com. So Mike Bankole, welcome to Byline Radio. Good to have you with us. You're right.
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Yeah, nice to speak to you, Mike. I think your first time on Byline Radio.
It is actually, yeah.
No, great. So, Mike, for people who haven't heard this development, just explain the change that Priti Patel has initiated and why it's so important.
So the government is lifting restrictions placed on stop and search in areas where they anticipate violent crime. So they essentially see an expansion of the use of Section 60. Now, Section 60 gives officers the right to search people without reasonable grounds. And we're going to see an expansion of that as a result of this kind of new instruction by Priti Patel. So the reason why this is problematic is because even with this reasonable reason or reasonable grounds to search or to stop and search, we still see racialized outcomes when it comes to stop and search. We still see Black people more likely to be stopped and searched. We still see Black people more likely to face force by the police. So removing that safeguard, removing that requirement is only going to exacerbate those racialized outcomes when it comes to policing. And that's obviously a massive issue because we have seen in the past what can happen when there is tension between ethnic minority communities and the police. And, this will lead to more Black people, more ethnic minorities being stopped and searched without reasonable grounds, and that's likely to cause more tension. And, that's obviously not good for kind of society and kind of cohesion, which we've been hopefully trying to build towards following the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020.
Now, the government says the changes are part of its strategy to tackle violent crime. And there are still restrictions, aren't there, I think, on the amount of time that...
Yes.
So unrestricted, as it were, I know it's a contradiction in terms, that unrestricted stop and search can be operated. So I think it can only be enforced for 24 hours, although it can then be extended
to 48 hours.
24 hours, so up to 48 hours. So it isn't the right for the police to indiscriminately stop and search at all times. It will be at particular periods. But previously, as I understand it, the law said it was at times when the police believe that serious violence will occur, but the language has changed. Now it's at moments when the police believe that serious violence may occur. What's the significance of those little linguistic tweaks?
I think an important point to make is even when we had this kind of reasonable grounds for a stop and search, we still saw that loosely interpreted by the police. So it could be that there's a group of young black men, together in a group, and that's reasonable grounds to stop and search for those black men because they're in a group, and that's maybe deemed as subjectively viewed as to be suspicious demeanor or suspicious behaviour. So even removing that, what happens is you're going to open up a can of worms where black men are being stopped and searched for absolutely no reason, and yeah, it's obviously going to lead to some really racialised outcomes.
Yeah, and again, one of the caveats previously was that the police had to inform communities that these unrestricted stop and search powers were in force. Again, now, as I understand it, there is no requirement upon the police to inform communities. So if you're a young black man or any person walking down the street, the police, the first you might hear of this is the moment at which you are stopped and searched.
Yeah, what's funny about kind of expanding stop and search powers is that stop and search is actually really ineffective. So I think there's a really robust study by some academics using police data, and they found that stop and search has little to no impact when it comes to reducing or deterring violent crime. So the idea that stop and search powers being expanded by the Conservative government to address violent crime in particular areas, it misses the mark when it comes to what the data says and what the data tells us about how effective stop and search is. So if anything, if the governments are concerned with, as Boris Johnson said today in a cabinet meeting apparently, if they are concerned with addressing crime, well, actually expanding stop and search powers is likely to have the opposite effect. Stop and search there's literally no evidence to suggest stop and search is effective when it comes to reducing violent crime.
For younger listeners, I think it's perhaps worth revisiting the SUS laws, which are a kind of a version of stop and search, aren't they? Almost a prehistoric version of it, but for many of us, a law that was in force in our lifetimes. The SUS laws, which were contributory factors really to the riots of the 1980s. I'm sure you're too young to have been there, Michael, but you know how significant these were.
No, I know exactly how significant they were, and often when we see some of the disturbances and riots that have happened in parts of England, they happen as a result of tension between the police and people of colour, minorities. So I think about the London riots of 2011, which I did live through, which I was old enough to kind of experience, and it happened around me. It happened in the borough I live in Wandsworth. There were several riots, and when you look at the data on that, what we saw is that there was a clear link between stop and search rates and the London boroughs of rioters. So the London boroughs that had the highest stop and search rates, these are the boroughs where we saw riots. So actually, the riots were caused by this growing tension between the police and different communities across London. That's only going to be exacerbated now when you see this expansion of stop and search powers without the reasonable grounds. Removing that is going to lead to more black people being stopped and searched, as I've kind of said several times already. And yeah, as you mentioned, with the SARS laws, this kind of growing tension between black and minority communities and the police is not a good thing. And I think another really important point to make is that I feel like black and minority ethnic people in this country feel like they're already punched down at by this government. When it came to responding to the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, the government commissioned this report, the Cell report, which essentially tries to minimise the existence of institutional racism. So this is a government that have shown a real lack of desire to address racial inequalities. And by expanding the ability for police officers to stop and search, people without reasonable ground, I think they're showing a commitment or lack of commitment to really want to address racial inequality and racial justice. So, this is a real problem, I feel.
Yeah. To just go back to the SUS laws, the SUS laws were, I think, part of the 1824 Vagrancy Act, I'm pretty sure in saying. And they were seen as a contributory factor to the Brixton riots in the early 80s. And the police only had to have grounds for suspicion, hence SUS, in order to stop somebody on the street. And I think it's now widely recognised that those powers were abused, particularly by the Metropolitan Police in London, but also the police forces around the country, and effectively gave the police carte blanche to stop anybody they wanted. But those laws, as with stop and search laws now, were disproportionately used against visible minority people and particularly against young black men in inner cities.
Yeah, we did see that. So I think the SUS laws, the reason why they were so controversial is it meant the police officers could stop and search literally anyone they wanted to on the basis of suspicion alone. And as you mentioned, this was weaponized against, black men in particular. And I think we have so much evidence and so much data that suggests that black people, black men, especially, going to be on the sharp edge of the state violence under the guise of stop and search. So black people are 6 times more likely to face force by the police. They're nearly twice as likely to die during or immediately after contact with the police. These are really damning numbers. We look at the lockdown. I remember lockdown and how those rules were enforced, especially in the early phase of lockdown in 2020. And what we saw in London during lockdown was that 20,000 young black men were stopped and searched by the police. That's much higher than the numbers for young white men. So with the conditions in place, with safeguards in place, we still see these really disproportionate outcomes. The government are now removing some of the safeguards that exist at the moment that have made life somewhat bearable, you could argue, for young black men. So this is almost a return to maybe the SUS law era, if you like.
Yeah, sorry, your line was slightly scratchy there for a moment, Mike. Let's bring in Omar Moore, who's a regular contributor to our Byline Radio and Byline Times podcast discussions. Hello, Omar. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Adrian. Thanks very much again for your valuable programming. And Mike, really appreciate you being on to talk about this. I actually wanted to, and I know, Adrian, you brought this up, point to the IOPC report, because there was an IOPC report in February of this year, which detailed a lot of the abuses that were happening at the Charing Cross police station in particular in London. And all of these kinds of outgrowths of abuse of people and the kinds of things that the police were saying about black people, about women in general, of all racial backgrounds, and about a number of other groups. It's just another reason why I think what we've got now with the scrapping of reasonable grounds is tantamount to a really, I think, a totalitarian approach to policing black people and people in general, particularly black people. And I want to just mention the whole situation regarding youth, because we're talking, we mentioned black men, but we also have to really talk about black youngsters, boys and girls. I mean, people who aren't 18 or older than that. We're talking about kids that get stopped, girls that get stopped, black girls, black boys. Look at what happened to Child Q in school, or in that realm just a few months ago. It was reported just recently, but it happened a few months ago. And this is going to open the door now to even greater abuse. And as Mike points out, you're going to be seeing more of this, and you're not going to see any crime deterrence. I mean, crime is going to continue. This is not about stopping crime. This is about abusing power of young people who are black, boys and girls. And this is all this is going to amount to at this point. And there have been so many inquiries. The Angelini inquiry back in 2017, I believe it was. It was a 300-page report. And what we got out of that were all of these guidelines that said, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to do. And we've not seen any changes at all. And Priti Patel had called for several inquiries. I think she called for the Angelini inquiry back at the time, maybe, but nothing has been done. And I don't see where deterring crime comes from here. There is, as Mike points out, and I'll just say this to end with, there's absolutely no correlation with all this stop and frisk. We've seen the studies, as Mike points out. There's absolutely no good reason for this at all. And we are now moving further and further, whether it's the policing bill, whether it's the lifting now of the reasonable grounds, we are moving ever closer to a very totalitarian approach. And it is something that is very disturbing, and we have to continue to speak out about it. So those are just a few of the thoughts that I have. I don't want to take up too much more time because there's a lot of other things I had on my mind, but I think I'll just leave it there for now.
Well, before you disappear, Omar, let me just share an experience with you, and I don't know whether Mike will have something to contribute on this. I present as white. For what it's worth, I have quite a varied ethnic makeup, but to all intents and appearances, if you see me on the street, I'm a white guy. Now, I remember once I was moving home. I think I'd fallen out with my girlfriend and I was going to live in a crummy flat somewhere in Birmingham, and I had pretty much all my worldly possessions in a suitcase. And I was walking down quite a nice leafy street to the rather less nice and less leafy flat that I was heading to. And I was stopped. I was just walking along. I was probably early 20s, and two police officers stopped me. And they said, "Can we have a look in your suitcase? What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm moving home as it happens." And they said, "Well, can we have a look in the suitcase?" And I said, "Well, I'd rather not, if you don't mind." I felt quite affronted by this. I felt it was an unnecessary challenge. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and I was feeling pretty low about the situation that I was in. But they were insistent. They were adamant. There were two of them. I'm quite a short and physically unimposing person, so I felt quite threatened by these police officers. I mean, this is many years ago now. And, that's without the baggage of discrimination on a daily basis throughout my life, without the baggage of being looked at with suspicion, basically with what we would now call the advantage of white privilege. And I felt very angry at that point. I felt, as I opened my suitcase and showed them that I hadn't stolen anything, and they justified this search on the basis that there had been a lot of burglaries in the area recently, as if you'd be escaping on foot with a suitcase. But it stuck with me. It stuck with me for many years and angered me and alienated me from the police as a young man. And as I say, that's just from my particular perspective.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Liam. I just wanted to touch on the point you raised actually earlier about young people, and I do think that's a really important point to raise. So there was a story in The Guardian towards the back end of last year. It was reported that a 14-year-old boy, black boy, had been stopped by the police 30 times in a 2-year period. Now, what's really sad about this is because this is his first kind of encounter with the state, if you like. He's been stopped by the police 30 times. No charges have been made. But that can't be right. This is going to shape, his life. He's going to be suspicious of authority figures, and you could argue rightfully so. This is really damaging what we're doing to young people here. Constantly treating them with suspicion, just for existing. This can't be right. And I feel, you raised the point about, women and some of the scenes we've seen in Charing Cross and some of the things that have come out. This feels like the most tone-deaf moment to expand police powers. We've literally seen several examples of the police overstepping the mark when they've been given more powers. I think Wayne Cousin used, COVID regulations during the murder of Sarah Everard. So, expanding police powers at this moment in our history feels like an incredibly tone-deaf and deeply insensitive thing to do.
Go on, Omar. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, Mike speaks exactly to the point that I'm making, because I really don't see where you are. If you are really trying to reduce crime, there we have knife crime, we have all kinds of crime across London and beyond. If you're really trying to reduce that, you really have to take a hard look in the mirror and ask yourself, does stop and frisk, and furthermore, removing reasonable grounds from stop and frisk, effectuate a reduction or any attempt to reduce crime? And it doesn't. It clearly does not. And the last thing I want to say about this is that when you're looking at all of the abuses that Mike has raised, that I've mentioned and that you've mentioned, whether it's with Sarah Everard, whether it's with Child Q, whether it's with the appalling behavior of the police after I think the two young black girls had been had been found dead, and they were taking cell phone pictures and sharing them and all kinds of things of their bodies and having jokes about that and how disgusting that was. There is an attempt to curb the behavior of the police here. You can have a million IOPC reports, and you can have the Angelini inquiry, and you can have these all these reports. But until there's concrete action, and there's a change of the culture and the entrenchment of the institutionalized racism in the country, I don't think you're going to see very much changing. And it is incumbent upon us to continue to vote. I know that we've got this elections bill that's very troublesome. And the policing bill, of course, is a very troublesome thing. So we have to keep voting. We have to keep putting our voices up and communicating and educating. And this really troublesome policing bill just is the rotten cherry on top of a rotten cake. I mean, you've got the lifting of reasonable grounds. I think, again, I want to just reemphasize once again, this is a move toward totalitarianism. In fact, I would dare say we're already in that moment here. And
Omar, just to kind of question that a little bit, I'd say two things about this. I'm not necessarily arguing against your broader narrative here, but you know, there are restrictions to this law. The right of the police to stop and search when they suspect there may be serious violence afoot. That's one restriction. There may be serious violence afoot, and it is restricted initially for 24 hours, can then be authorised for a further 24 hours, adding up to 48 hours in total. It's not an untrammeled right to stop and search indiscriminately. And at that point, at least, in theory anyway, it does. There is a distance, and it's one of the reasons why I mentioned the SUS laws earlier. There is distance between this legislation and the SUS laws.
One last thing, though, just to come back to you for a moment, Adrian, is that even with the contouring of the temporal moment, the 24-hour period, the fact that reasonable grounds are lifted, to me, is extremely problematic. And even in the context of a 24-hour period, lifting reasonable grounds, to me, says all bets are off. And even within a 24-hour period, reasonable grounds gives them, the lifting of that gives the police carte blanche, and that disturbs greatly.
It is disturbing. Just to go back on the photographs that you mentioned as well, I think it's worth noting that the two women whose murdered bodies were photographed by the two police officers were Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, and two Metropolitan Police officers, Dennis Jaffa and Jamie Lewis, were convicted of the crime, having photographed and joked around the death of those two bodies, which, of course, it doesn't make it okay. But again, it does indicate at least that there is some semblance of decency somewhere in the police. But in that case, sadly, it took a long time to find it. Mike, I just want to touch you about, and Omar touched on the Child Q case, and a phrase in a discussion that we had on the podcast at that time just resonates with me. And you talked about a 14-year-old lad who'd been stopped 30 times by the police. And this is the adultification of black children in particular. You know, they are seen as adult and treated as adult in a way that particularly their white counterparts aren't.
Yeah, it really is worrying, because what happens is you also, in some cases, view yourself as less than. So if you're constantly being treated as a criminal, you're constantly being treated with suspicion, you're going to think, maybe is there something wrong with me? Is there something I'm doing? You do enter that phase, sometimes you do end up blaming yourself. And it's important that young people aren't being treated as criminals at such a young age. They aren't being brutalized by the police, because that can really shape your life in negative ways. It's so damaging for young people. I can't explain this enough, because these people, this is their first encounter with the state, constantly being stopped and searched. I mean, we have so many stories of people who have been angered by this, and their life's chances have been shaped negatively by this. So it is really sad. We do see this adultification of young people, and we do see this overly repressive state apparatus being used against them. And this kind of new introduction by Priti Patel is only going to exacerbate this, I feel.
Yeah. The government's argument for this is to challenge violent crime, particularly knife crime. I mean, is there anything to be said for that argument? I mean, clearly anybody who walks the streets, which is pretty much all of us, any of us who have children, which is some of us, will be concerned about the prevalence of knife crime and, the devastating impact. I've spoken to far too many people who've lost loved ones, people I should hasten to add of varying ethnicities. But, there is sadly a lot of violent crime out there. There is sadly a lot of violent knife crime out there.
Well, I think a lot of us listening to this are truly worried and appalled by this sort of spate of knife crime that we've seen for a number of years in London and across Britain. But stop and search, as I kind of mentioned earlier, there's no data that suggests that stop and search reduces or deters violent crime. And I think instead of expanding police powers, and again, I feel like this is a really weird moment to do that. Instead of expanding police powers, the government should be focused on a more proactive approach to tackling crime. So a more proactive approach, in my view, is investment in early intervention, it's investment in mental health services, it's reversing cuts to youth services. These are the ways in which we can reduce crime, rather than criminalising young people, rather than brutalising young black people, rather than treating black people with suspicion and increasing tension between minority communities and the police. It's important, I thought, to be more proactive. Expanding police powers at this moment in time, again, just feels really tone deaf, and ultimately it's ineffective. If you want to address crime and address violent crime in Britain and London, wherever it might be, expanding police powers and giving them more power to stop and search people simply is not the answer. And the data tells us that.
And Mike, last year, the Sewell report was published. This was a report commissioned by Boris Johnson, and the report found that there is no evidence of structural racism in Britain. And structural racism is kind of one of those phrases, I think, that people, if they're not steeped in it, just might find a little bit difficult and a little bit alienating. But I suppose when we talk about structural racism, and I think apart from Sewell himself, very few people would think that there isn't evidence of structural racism. But to kind of demonstrate that this thing exists, you say, well, look at the disproportionate number of black people in prison, the disproportionate number of black people in mental health institutions, for example, or within the mental health service. And it doesn't take long, really, to demonstrate that we are a structurally racist society. But the Sewell report, which, as I say, was kind of condoned and commissioned by the government, seemed almost set up to demonstrate an outcome that the government wanted, which is to suggest that there is no such thing as structural racism.
Well, the Sewell report was commissioned with conclusions already in mind, right? It's one of the most widely discredited reports in government history. And it was a crude attempt to shift the focus away from systemic racism. Look, when we speak about systemic racism, we are essentially speaking about institutions that reproduce racialized outcomes that negatively disproportionate people of color. And the police is one of the most obvious examples of that. Again, we have seen so many sort of bits of evidence, bits of data that suggest that black people are more likely to face force by the police and more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. These are all racialized outcomes, and we see that the institution of policing consistently produce these racialized outcomes. So I do think the Sewell report, it really does fly in the face of evidence and the lived experiences of people of colour. People of colour are on the sharp edge of a state violence by the police. I'm sure lots of black people in this country can tell you exactly what institutional racism is because they've experienced it. They live it. Unfortunately, we live it every single day. We live it every single day. And I think the Sewell report was, again, the government's trying to, I think even some parts of the report blame minority communities for racism or for the racism they experience. So it was a crude attempt to shift focus away from systemic racism. It's not a report that's been taken seriously by many scholars or thinkers on race and racism in Britain.
No, but I suppose crucially, though, it has been adopted by government, hasn't it, as evidence that structural or systemic racism doesn't really exist and therefore can be ignored. So it just kind of, I suppose, highlights the difficulty. If you start from that point of view, then, the kind of discussion that we're having, it's kind of like there is one discussion over there being held by ministers amongst themselves, and then there's this other discussion that we're having over here.
I think that's an important point, Adrian. And I think what the government's approach to racism has been since the uprisings we saw. Again, those protests we saw in 2020 were the largest anti-racist protest in British history. So in response to that, the government's approach has been to minimise the existence of racism in Britain. It's been to say, well, listen, Britain is a fantastic place for people of colour, for ethnic minorities to live. Sure, we have our issues, but there are issues in other parts of the world, and they will obviously point to America as the obvious example of that. And I think what's really dangerous about this approach is that the Conservative Party weaponised its minority MPs to justify this. So you see people like Priti Patel, she's the face of the authoritarian politics that are going to disproportionately affect people of colour, ethnic minorities in Britain. So it is really, really dangerous. I think ultimately the government's response to race and racism issues has been to manufacture this culture war. So all the Black Lives Matter activists, all the Black Lives Matter thinkers, all of us who protested in 2020, we've been framed by the government as people who complained about nothing. It's racism, of course it exists, but institutional racism, don't be silly, guys. Come on, that's not really an issue here. There are some instances of individualized racism, and there have been some, unfortunate outcomes in policing, but it's not really an issue. That's the government's tone. And if you raise concerns about Britain's history and how that feeds into what happens today, or racism in Britain today, you are deemed to be a woke, anti-British culture warrior who is pursuing a radical woke agenda. That's been the government's approach to race and racism. And I think what's important for us is to really push back against that and to continually provide examples of institutional racism in Britain, of our lived experiences, bear this out. And it's important to keep raising our voices about this and to keep putting pressure on the government, because this is the government that don't have the best interests of minorities at heart, despite the fact that it's the most diverse cabinet we've had in Britain.
Very interesting point, Mike. Thank you. Adrian Goldberg here with Byline Radio, or if you're listening on Catch Up, on the Byline Times podcast. And I'm joined by Mike Bankole from King's College London, also co-host the Jam Politics podcast. And we're talking about the lifting of certain restrictions on stop and search. And if you want to join in and you're listening live on Byline Radio, if you're listening on your smartphone and using the Twitter app, you will see a little microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you've got an experience to share or a question to ask or just a comment that you want to make, by all means do join in. Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast come from the Byline Times, and the Byline Times is an independent, fearless monthly newspaper. If you take out a subscription to the Byline Times, you'll not only be getting a great quality newspaper, which tells the truth without reflecting any corporate or political agenda, you'll also be helping to support the podcast and Byline Radio. So go on, do it. It's a good thing to do. Get more details on our website at bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com. Omar Moore is with us as well. And for those of you who don't know Omar is a regular contributor to Byline Radio. He's a lawyer. He also makes the Popcorn Reel podcast as well, and finds himself drawn to join in. So let's make the most of you being here, Omar. Are there any pertinent differences, Omar, any relevant differences between stop and search in the UK and the United States where you now live?
It's a great question, Adrian. I think there are, in all respects, not really, except the fact that here in the United States, it's a bit more expansive. The police have even more power. In a great sense, in a real sense, they are literally, and I guess it would apply in my native country there in the UK, they are literally judge, jury, and executioner. Their police powers are broadly protected by the United States Supreme Court, by state laws. And in a lot of jurisdictions across this country, police have untrammeled power. They really do. And when police are, on the rare occasions that police are indicted, and it's extremely rare that they are brought up on charges for anything, on those very rare occasions, the juries in trials, their standard is what the reasonable officer would have done in the circumstances, which gives broad latitude for the officer in question. But specifically to stop and frisk itself, the kinds of ingredients that are placed in United States jurisdictions is the same, except there's just broader police power in general. They're much broader, a lot more latitude. There aren't the time periods. You've cited this, Adrian, about the time period. The lifting of reasonable grounds does in the UK. There is not a 24-hour time period at all. The police can at any time stop you at any time they want to. There doesn't have to be any real articulable suspicion except for what's called probable cause. And often that gets violated. Let me give you one quick example of this. The last week or two, a coach was stopped on the highway, I believe it was in Virginia or in another state, I forget which state it was, of lacrosse players. An all-black female lacrosse team was stopped. And they were initially, the stop was for the driver of the coach being in the wrong lane, being in the lane that he perhaps should not have been in. Then the police who stopped the coach came into the coach and told the entire lacrosse team, an all-black female lacrosse team, we are searching you to see if there are any drugs in your bag. And so for the next, goodness knows how long it is, 20 minutes or so, they actually brought a police dog in to search the bags. They actually didn't find anything at all, which is no surprise, but they actually opened up one of the bags that had a gift in it that was unwrapped. That was actually wrapped, excuse me. And they asked the person whose bag it was, well, what's this? And then the person said, well, it's a gift from someone to me. And then the police officer said to her, well, why haven't you opened it? Why is it? So the bottom line is here is that they are being sued, these police, for doing this. And you would think that when a dog that's sniffing drugs would actually be barking before that dog even starts to really search anything. So the bottom line is that it was an unreasonable search, and that's what is being alleged by the all-female lacrosse team. So that's an example of untrammeled and unabridged police power, which is dangerous, which violates all kinds of constitutional rights. And that is stop and search. That really is an unjustified thing. So that's just one example.
And I guess, Mike, the fear is that this change in the law is a further notch towards Britain heading that way, the way of the United States.
Yeah, it is a real fear. And again, I do feel like we are keen in Britain to constantly point to the United States and be like, oh, look at how terrible things are there. Things are so bad over there. And look, I understand it. America's a more police crime and violence against black people is more lethal on the basis that America's a more lethal country than the UK. But we do have our own issues here, and I think we have our own issues to confront and face here. We do see similar kind of racialized outcomes when it comes to stop and search and policing. And yeah, the trajectory of the country at the moment when it comes to racial justice in all guises, in all forms, across all sectors of society, is deeply worrying. I don't think the Conservative government, despite the diversity that they boast about so often and they actually weaponise, I don't think this Conservative government have the interest of minorities at heart, and that is deeply, deeply concerning.
Let's bring in Sarah, who wants to join in our conversation. Welcome to Byline Radio, Sarah. How are you?
Good evening, all. I'm very well, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to apologise in that I don't know what the restrictions that have been lifted are, but I just want to share some observations that I've got. So, because with stop and search, it's kind of there all the time, but then things happen that remind you of just, how just ridiculous it is. But anyway, so the first thing that happened with me recently was you must have all seen the two black guys that were wearing puffer jackets and were stopped because they weren't appropriately dressed for the weather, which when you're black, we don't feel the heat the way everybody else does. I mean, I know for sure for me, like at work, I've got a scarf, I've got cardigan, because when the AC is on and I'm cold, I'd rather I regulate myself than have somebody speak to FM to do all of that. So that was the first thing, those two guys getting stopped for wearing their puffers. And, who knows what they do for a living, what time of day they left home, but their clothing wasn't appropriate for the weather. So that was the reason to get stopped. And then, and then shortly after them, there's a group called Mentivity, I think they're called. And these, it's like a youth mentoring organisations. So these young people, they were just out having their lunch on Walworth Road, actually, where Prince Charles was recently getting all the hugs and kisses. They were just on their lunch break, and then a police van saw them. And when the police started talking to them, they said, well, we've stopped you because we were driving past, and when you saw us, you all went in different directions. And in my head, I thought, well, if I was them as well, I'm like, there's a group of 4 or 5 of us. You see a police van, you think, oh, you know what, let's not be in a group because we might get stopped. Let's just disperse, whatever. I don't know. Anyways, and then after those 2 incidents, I thought to myself, you know what, if I see a young person of colour that, and I kind of just randomly said, looks under 25, how I decide that, I don't know. I'm going to be an active bystander. So just last week, actually, I came out of the car park, High Street Ken, going onto the High Street to go and buy a stupid candle. And then I was walking and I saw 3 police officers, all white, and they were surrounding this, he looked about 16, black kid. And I was kind of walking, and then I thought, hold on a minute, doubled back, and I thought, no, I need to do something. So I went over to him and I said, are you okay? And he was like, yeah, I'm okay. I kind of walked away, but didn't walk away. I walked away so that I was still I could see what was going on, and I wasn't going to leave until I knew that he was okay and he'd been let go. And I think about after 5 minutes, they kind of walked off, got in their van, and off they went. But I guess my thing is, yes, they've kind of enacted this, or they're going to make it happen. But what are we going to do to be active bystanders, especially with young people, just to ensure that, they're okay, they're comfortable? Because that particular young man, whilst I asked him, was he okay? And then I kind of walked away to be, in the line of sight, but not directly involved. It was that thing of, I don't want to go up to him and say to him, are you okay? I don't know how many times he's been stopped before. Is it his first time? Is he feeling rubbish about it? But I just want to know, what are we doing to be actively there more for the younger people, if that doesn't sound too selfish for elder black men that are kind of going through it?
No, I think you raise a really good point, Sarah. You mentioned the 2 guys in the puffer jackets. The one story that I can remember was a guy in Croydon in South London, and the police stopped him for wearing too many layers in warm weather. It's just, one of those bizarre incidents that it's difficult to ascribe to anything other than racism. I'd welcome thoughts from Mike and Omar in terms of what we can do as active bystanders. I just want to throw in one story, Sarah, that on the Byline Times podcast a little while ago, we were talking about the Metropolitan Police and the departure of Cressida Dick. And of course, that was indirectly related to the awful comments that were made by officers at Charing Cross Police Station, racist, sexist, misogynist, whatever, all of the above. But one lady called, I think, Koshka Duff from memory, who I interviewed, Koshka was being an active bystander, and she was encouraging, I think, a young man who was being stopped to know his rights, was handing out leaflets to people if they were being arrested by the police. She ended up herself being strip searched by the Metropolitan Police, and it took her years, about 8 years, for the Metropolitan Police to finally apologise for that. And, she was in the right, the police were in the wrong. That was ultimately where we got to. But
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, there is a risk to being an active. I wouldn't discourage you, by the way. I think it's important that we're all sort of active bystanders in all sorts of ways in society. But, there is a risk associated with it.
I think a lot of this goes back to your earlier point, Adrian. You spoke about how young black people have to grow up a lot older than maybe others. And unfortunately, to kind of deter or to let these young people, to provide them support, it's important for us to let them know their rights. And I remember as a young person growing up, I used to always hear my parents say, you have to work twice as hard, you have to do this. And I used to think, what on earth are they talking about? Why are they talking to me about all this stuff? But as you get older and older, you realise, and I do think, unfortunately, for young people, when it comes to being active bystanders, it is about reminding them of their rights if they do get stopped and searched. And I think something that's been really important in recent years has been the rise of social media. Social media has allowed us to see some of the most egregious examples of police violence against black people. and it has, brought to light some of these issues. So sometimes being an active bystander is about raising these issues and placing them on social media so everyone else can see, and we can kind of mobilize support together and campaign against some of the violence we see. So I think it's about supporting young people and making sure they know their rights, which I feel is really unfortunate, because we are asking young people who are 13, 14 to grow up in some cases and know that unfortunately you might get stopped and searched by the police and you might be brutalized by the police. That is just really, really sad that we live in a world like that. But unfortunately, it has to be done at the moment as things stand. And also kind of filming things on social media, putting them on social media, raising awareness on social media, because the police, unfortunately, are trying to, or the governments are trying to cut down on protest. So protest might actually be another way in which police violence is used against, people of colour. So it's important, maybe social media is, I think, is an important forum for raising these issues.
Just to clarify, by the way, and we've got people joining us certainly on Byline Radio Live, joining us all the time. Obviously, if you're on the podcast, you're listening from the start, I guess. But just to clarify what the changes in the law are, this was a letter to police forces from Priti Patel under Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. The law gives police officers the right to search people without reasonable grounds when, in the police's view, serious violence is expected. And this unrestricted right to stop and search can initially be for 24 hours. That can be extended then to 48 hours. Previously, you needed a senior police officer to sign off this particular provision, but now it can be an officer as junior as an inspector. And so it's this sense, isn't it, that the police are more able to do this and will be able to do it more often than they currently do, and it will become less exceptional. It may also be, and I think this is worth reflecting on, Mike, it may just be the normal way in which these things are done, but the fact that it was the change was flagged up in a letter to police forces. This is how we change the law. This was not subject to parliamentary scrutiny or debate. And Omar's talking about the move towards totalitarianism. I don't want to get too hyped up about that, or I suspect we'd get more listeners if I did. But, I think we need to be very wary of authoritarianism and a creep towards totalitarianism. But when something of this magnitude isn't discussed in Parliament, isn't debated, then that is worrying, actually, isn't it, from that point of view?
It is worrying. And I think this is a government that tries to avoid accountability at all costs. So we are seeing the crackdown on protests. That's a response to both the Black Lives Matter protest and also some of the activism by climate activists who've been raising concerns about the climate and climate change. We've also seen the introduction of voter ID, which will disproportionately affect people of colour and their ability to vote in elections. So this is a government that actually don't like accountability, and forcing legislation of this magnitude through the back door is another reminder of that. This isn't the government that's like being scrutinised in any way, and as well as not liking accountability or being scrutinised, they are advocating for and putting in place deeply authoritarian policies. And the fear is that you blink and then before you know it, Britain has become, or has become a fully authoritarian state, which is a real likelihood under this Conservative government.
Yeah, and I'm not being dismissive, by the way, of Omar. He brings great insights. But I think the word you use, actually, is probably more accurate, I think. Authoritarian rather than totalitarian. I know we're dancing on the head of a pin, maybe, which Orwellian nightmare we're choosing to describe. But I think authoritarian, the idea that the government can impose things, can do things without checks, without balances. It's not quite totalitarian, is it? But it is certainly veering towards authoritarianism. I think it's a really interesting point. Diane, I thought Diane wanted to join in for a moment. I was going to invite Diane into the conversation, but Diane has just disappeared completely. So, Omar, will you accept my challenge and that it's maybe an authoritarian drift rather than a totalitarian one?
I would actually, I and rarely do I do this with some of the things I say about these things, but yeah, I think I may have jumped just a little bit there. I think authoritarianism is the realm, so I would certainly agree. I think in saying totalitarianism, went a little bit too far. I think
that's very reasonable of you too. We can't have radio phone-ins where people politely agree. That's madness. Let's bring in Ryan, who wants to join in. Hello, Ryan. How you doing? You okay?
Yes, hi. Good, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I think I've prematurely requested. I was going to request about 10 or 15 minutes into this because I've just joined as someone that's been repeatedly stopped and searched. I just got to get on with something, but I'm listening to this in the background. Is it okay if I can speak in about 10 minutes?
Yeah. No, if we're still at you, welcome. I love the way that Ryan just casually says he's been stopped and searched about 15 times. I mean, like Mike, you mentioned the lad who'd been stopped 30 times. I mean, here I am, prattling on about the one occasion that I can remember about 30 years ago when I was start walking around Birmingham with my suitcase. That was once, and that stuck with me. I don't know if you've ever been stopped and searched, Mike, but the psychological impact of that. And as I say, if you're part of a group, part of a community that experiences disadvantage in other ways as well, it will all reinforce your sense of perhaps not belonging, not feeling as though you're, in inverted commas, a proper member of society. And I mentioned earlier the kind of the disproportionate presence of black people in the mental health system, in psychiatric services, and you wonder how much this plays into that.
No, it's likely to play a massive role. If you're constantly being treated with suspicion from a young age, we have to remember we're talking about children as young as 14, being stopped and searched by the police, routinely stopped and searched by the police. If you're that young, constantly experiencing this abuse by the police, that's going to obviously have detrimental effects to your mental health. You're going to be thinking, as a young person, you're thinking, what have I done? Because as young people, you're taught to respect authority figures. You're taught to, you do as you're told. And if these people in authority with all this power are constantly stopping and searching, you might question yourself and think, am I doing something wrong? Is there something wrong with me as a person? So it's just so worrying because Ryan just casually mentioned that he's been stopped and searched 15 times. And that just shows you that for some people, they've grown up just knowing that that's a normal part of their life. And it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be that growing up, you know that you're going to be stopped and searched by the police routinely. That should not be a normal part of life for any young person.
Mm-hmm. Paul has sent me a very interesting message on Twitter, and he says the Macpherson report, and of course for people who don't know, I think it's worth pointing out the Macpherson report following the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence described for the first time institutional racism in the police, in the Metropolitan Police Force. So that's why this is significant. Paul says the Macpherson report in 1999 highlighted young black males being stopped and searched 5 times more than their white counterparts. In 2019, so 20 years on, young black males were 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. Now, that's just astonishing, isn't it? 20 years earlier, Macpherson identifies institutional racism, and yet in the 2 decades that follow, the situation has become even more disproportionately weighted against young black men. And that, Paul is good enough to quote Palm Sandhu, the first non-white chief superintendent at Scotland Yard. She said there was no significant reduction in knife crime. And in addition to Omar's comments, Paul says, what about those officers that already abuse their powers? Doesn't this give them even more opportunity to abuse? Does everyone stopped need to know the law to know when the mark has been overstepped? Go on, Omar.
I think Paul raises some really important questions, and I think that again with the authoritarian sweep here, you give, like you do here in the United States, a police officer the ability to be judge, jury, and executioner. Even if there's a temporal aspect to it, the time period, it just gives those persons who have already abused license to continue doing so, and with greater impunity. As I go back again to the IOPC report of February of this year, detailing the kinds of behaviors and the egregious behaviors of the police in Charing Cross Station in particular. You continue to breed a mindset like that when you continue to strip away the rights of people and expand police powers. It's just really, I hate to put it down as simple as that, but I think it is quite as simple as that. And when you've given people, when you've stripped away reasonable grounds, there's no gray areas left. There's absolutely none. And there's no correlation between you. There is no reduction in knife crime by doing it this way. There have to be, and Mike talked about this earlier, there have to be more proactive and better and more efficient ways of policing and engaging with people in communities. There has to be a wholesale change in how that's done. And certainly, as Paul mentions, why is it that every person would have to be educated on the law? Why can't, and this is a rhetorical question, why can't the police be the ones who have to look at what they do? Now, obviously, look, it's a rhetorical question. Then there needs to be changes throughout the institution itself. We have to start to redefine what policing is. That's really where I think foundationally we have to start, among other things.
And in the United States and around the Black Lives Matter movement, there has been this phrase, defund the police. I think from a British perspective, that can be quite difficult to understand, or certainly from my perspective, when you hear defund the police, it sounds a bit, what? You've got to have police. We want better police. You don't want racist police, but you've got to have police. But I've come to understand that call to defund the police to really be a call for the kind of things that Mike was talking about, Omar, the investment in prevention, the investment in diversion. So instead of equipping the police to the hilt with weaponry, you actually spend some of the money that might otherwise be spent on tooling them up, for want of a better phrase, with initiatives that might actually turn young people away from crime.
Absolutely. And just to be very brief, Adrian, in response, I think, number one, that's absolutely it. And I think the other things that you have to take into account is the reallocation of resources, because as you pointed out, there is a militarization of police here in the United States that you wouldn't know, depending on where you are in certain parts of the United States, whether you are in the United States or whether you are in Fallujah or whether you are in parts of Ukraine or elsewhere around the globe, because there are literally people, police officers, in tanks dealing with protest that's peaceful, and you've got tanks down the street. We've seen this in Ferguson, Missouri, in the Midwest in this country several years ago. We've seen this elsewhere. So, these are very important things. And definitely people who say defund the police, I don't necessarily think they mean just don't give them any money. I think that some of it is about reallocating resources, because, police in the main are quite well funded here in the United States. But I think certainly there needs to be a reallocation of resources to proactively police and engage in cultivating better relationships with people in communities. One of the things I would suggest, and people have suggested this before me, just very briefly, is to have police officers living in the neighborhoods that they are policing. I don't know if that's a requirement in the UK. I don't think it is. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But here in the United States, we need to have that. There are some municipalities that do that, but not very many.
Certainly not the UK. I mean, there's no sort of residential requirement for police officers in terms of whether they should live in the community that they police. Absolutely none. I'm very confident about that. Let's bring in Giesnock. An interesting handle.
Giesnock. I'm from Germany. A few weeks ago, I read an article, don't know the source, sorry, which said that the American police has a higher budget than the whole Russian army. So I think they are way overfunded. And in other countries, or in the United States, the police goes to a task or to a scene where in other countries a social worker or something with a medical job would go to. And then the police shows up there and, well, sometimes they kill people who are, who need a doctor. But, a few weeks ago or this happened in Germany also, but where a doctor called the police to help him with a patient, and but he wasn't shot. He was treated bad and died after that in the hospital.
Yeah. And, with respect, sorry, I don't want to get too far away from the focus of this discussion, which is about stop and search. But I wonder can you enlighten me? In Germany, what are the rules on stopping a member of the public and then police officers demanding the right to search them?
It's quite restricted. Normally they must have a reason, but sometimes in some areas they can stop anybody, like in the area of train stations and something like this, I think. But But normally they need a reason. They can't just stop anybody and search him.
Yeah, so this provision in the UK, which will only be brought in at certain times and in certain places of sort of unrestricted stop and search, that wouldn't generally hold in Germany.
Generally, they can, but it's restricted. Yeah, but I've seen so many videos in the last months about policing in the United States, and very bad policing, that I sometimes think, after seeing these videos with people explaining what was wrong, I know better about the rules for policemen in America than many policemen, I think, because they do so many things that are not allowed for them. That's it's sometimes I think it's ridiculous. Well, in Germany, the to become a policeman is between 2 years and 3 years of education before you become a policeman. And in some states in the United States, I heard it's possible to start to work as a policeman and then being said, well, he'll make the education and make the training in a year. And then after a year, they say, oh, no, well, he's worked enough as a policeman. He doesn't need the training. And then they are not trained and don't know what to do.
OK, let's bring Ryan into the conversation. Ryan's finished his extremely important other task now, and he can join us. Hello, Ryan. How are you doing?
You're right. Apologies for that. Like I said, I requested the mic. I was going to request the mic, but it was an accident at that point.
Listen, you're welcome. But you very casually said how many times you'd been stopped and searched.
I think you actually misheard me. I said I could speak in about 15 minutes. I've actually been stopped. Right. No, even worse. I've probably been stopped 30 plus times in my life. I've had my window smashed by police. I've been handcuffed through the window when things have not been found. I've had fines for illegal number plates, which were legal. So I've got numerous experience as someone who hasn't got a criminal background, as someone that is a working man. Someone that is law-abiding citizen, and I've had completely, they're actually quite surreal for me to even talk about them. If I didn't video document this, again, this is all on my pinned tweet on Twitter. If I didn't document these things, video evidence, pictures, and, actually live these experiences, I'd actually think I was dreaming and thinking I was actually going mental, because even saying this so casually, I've had my windows smashed. I've been fined for a number plates that are not legal. And they said they were illegal. They were adamant they were going to arrest me for it. And I've been handcuffed through my window, and it's actually interesting that you've popped up with this chat and it's on my timeline, because I've actually been stopped under Section 60. And when questioning officers, they said that there was a large smell of cannabis coming from my window. They're not going to smell that when they're tailing me with their van. And they can't see my number plate. I couldn't even see the number plate of the TSG van. If anyone doesn't know what TSG are, they're territorial support group, and with the Met Police, they're based in Chadwell Heath in East London. And even internally, police actually despise them. They're quite brutal. They will literally act like you're under arrest, and they will stereotype you to the worst possible outcome in their mind. Anyway.
And on that, Ryan, I mean, it just intrigues me the extent to which you have been stopped. And are you conscious of conforming to what might, in their minds, be a stereotype?
You know what? I've come to a point in my life where, like I said, this has happened 30 plus times. So I'm someone that is a believer, and also, through anecdotal evidence and, everything out there, that you have to video the police at every opportunity. Never rely on their footage. They will either not put it on, they will edit it out, they will blur things. You need to video the police. So prior to, camera phones, we had, even lesser things. We didn't have social media like we do now. So even then you couldn't really upload videos with high resolution and things like that. So, I've had police officers, racially abuse me. I've had police officers swear unprovoked, not casually in conversation. I actually don't care about that. It's when they're swearing at you, talking down to you, which they still do to me. They talk down to me. They patronize me, and we've been talking about, how it targets black and minority communities. So we're talking about the recent IOPC report that said black people were 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched. Mixed race and South Asian people were 2.5 times more likely to be stopped than their white counterparts. And when you look at that, you can see that, there is obvious stereotyping here, because I've just done a 600-mile trip just to Newcastle, and just doing that, you have to fear for yourself. Are you going to get pulled over? There's traffic officers and the motorway. It's interesting. I don't want to divert the conversation too much, but it's interesting because we were talking about taser use earlier as well. This is something that we're getting stop and search powers abused. We do not need police officers with tasers. As far as I know, I think we're going to be, giving the power to people that, I don't know how much some people agree with me, but I do believe police officers in general, not every officer, have quite fragile egos. And when you give them this kind of power, they enjoy exerting it. They enjoy seeing people, under their power. So
again, for people who are not up with that conversation, Ryan, the proposal is that volunteer police officers, special constables, will be issued with tasers. They'll have to go through whatever appropriate training the police consider, but nevertheless, you've got effectively, volunteers in uniform able to wield tasers in this country. That's wow, isn't it? That's a wow moment. Giesnock wanted to come back in, I think, and comment on what you said, Ryan. Go on, Giesnock.
I just wanted to say, but in Germany, we also have problems with police and racial profiling, because if they want to stop somebody, they'll find a reason, maybe. Yeah, that's always easier. And people who don't look as the standard German, with German parents, are controlled more often and more frequently than people who look German. Or standard German.
Stereotypically German, blonde hair, blue eyes. Yeah.
Well, I look like that, but I have ancestors from all over Europe, and so then I was never stopped for one time I was stopped and with an officer have the hand on his gun, because where I lived there was a big psychiatric hospital with also a prison for for special criminals who have psychological problems, and one of them was on the run, and I looked familiar, but then I showed them my ID, and they knew I wasn't the psycho killer.
Well, phew, we're relieved about that, Giesnock. Mike, I just kind of want to end really by reflecting on where some of this might lead us, because not that these were stop and search cases, but the reason why black people in particular have to fear the police are cases like Sean Rigg, they're cases like Mikey Powell, where black people have been taken into custody and have not come out alive. And there are some frightening statistics about the number of deaths in custody involving black people, black men in particular, and the number or the lack of convictions relating to that. You know, this can escalate into something that is more than the already significant harassment that stop and search sometimes constitutes.
Yeah, 100%. Look, we know already as things stand, without the relaxation of stop and search powers, we know that stop and search is not used proportionately or fairly. That's only likely to get worse. And ultimately, this has led to racialized policing. And racism is a matter of life and death. So what we are talking about here is something that could potentially be faced. I mentioned the stat earlier that Black people are 6 times more likely to face force by the police in Britain and twice likely to die during or following interaction with the police. You know, expanding police powers is only going to lead to more racialized outcomes that disproportionately affect people of colour in Britain. It's something we should all worry about. And I think this is all reflective of the government's strategy when it comes to racism. I mentioned it earlier, but the governments aren't concerned with addressing racism. If anything, the governments are pursuing a racist agenda that is going to disproportionately affect people of colour in all aspects. Looking at something like the cost of living and the way they're ignoring that has racialised outcomes too. This government do not care about people of colour. Unfortunately, we're going to have to continue to raise our voice and raise awareness about these issues because they are matters of life and death.
Really appreciate your time today, Mike. Thank you very much indeed. It was your debut, so we'll definitely get you back here again. Thanks very much indeed for taking part. Really good to hear from Mike and from Omar as well. Mike Bankole researches racism, race and representation at King's College London, co-hosts the Jam Politics podcast, well worth checking out. And Omar Moore as well joined us as a sort of main guest, really. Omar, is it Popcorn Reels, isn't it, the podcast, Omar? Your movie podcast?
I do have a podcast called the Popcorn Reel Podcast. I also have a podcast called the Politicrat Daily Podcast as well that deals more with politics.
There you go then. So there, we're giving all the necessary plugs, haven't we? Thank you. Really appreciate it both. And everybody who's joined in the conversation as well. I think it's really important, and it's a conversation I fear we may have again perhaps sometime soon on Byline Radio and the Byline Times podcast. But really appreciate everybody who's listened and taken part as well. And just to remind you, if you want to support these kind of conversations and the kind of probing journalism that we do on Byline Times, then, and let's be honest, you're not really going to hear this kind of conversation anywhere, and I mean anywhere, on mainstream media, both in terms of length and depth, or even the question being asked, really, I don't think. Anyway, hopefully you'll agree with me and decide to take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's a brilliant monthly paper, but the subscriptions also pay for Byline Radio, Byline Times podcast, Byline TV as well. Get more details at website bylinetimes.com. Thanks very much indeed, everyone. We'll see you again very soon. Do stay tuned to @Byline Radio, and that's where you'll find details of our upcoming Twitter Spaces. Thanks very much indeed. Take care, everyone. Good night. Cheers.